Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. If you want to start slicing and dicing and grouping together the various soldiers that served in the armies during the Civil War, one group that really stands out to me because they left behind reminiscences and they were dependable, they were educated and could write are staff officers that served on both sides. In particular, on the Union side, the approximately 1,700 officers that went on to become brevet brigadier generals in honor of their wartime service. One of those men is pictured here. His name is James Fowler Rusling. His life dates were 1834 to 1918. He served for much of the Civil War as a staff officer in the Army of the Potomac. He's an 1854 graduate of Dickinson College, started out in the war as a first lieutenant and regimental quartermaster in the 5th New Jersey Infantry. That was in 1861, and he ends his service in 1867 with that brevet brigadier general rank, that honorary rank for his war service. Along the way, during his wartime service, he had the opportunity to work with plenty of the senior commanders in the Eastern Theater: George B. McClellan, Ambrose E. Burnside, Fighting Joe Hooker, George G. Meade, and others. At Gettysburg, Rusling served as an aide on the staff of Major General Daniel Sickles, who you students of the Civil War know suffered a terrible injury that resulted in the amputation of a leg. Or in the second day of the battle, Rusling escorted Sickles to Washington, D.C. for further treatment. Rusling also met many Western commanders, among them Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. Rusling also was great because he left behind his wonderful memoir, his observations of all of those generals in his 1889 book titled Men and Things I Saw in Civil War Days. I could go on and on about sharing bits and pieces of his book, but I want to focus on one of them. It's his reminiscence of Ulysses S. Grant, because Rusling puts his finger on two of the character traits and also left us with a wonderful description of how he saw Grant. Now, I think that some of what he saw is consistent with other references that you all have seen in the past or read in the past or heard in the past, but his has some interesting takes on it. So let's get to it. This is chapter 10 in his book, and it's titled Ulysses S. Grant. Rusling says, "My last commander, and clearly the greatest of them all, one of the greatest soldiers that ever lived, I say it advisedly, was General Grant. I first met him in January 1864 at Nashville, Tennessee, after the victory at Chattanooga and the relief of Knoxville. He had gone from Chattanooga to Knoxville, and when he found Burnside safe and sound, that's Ambrose E. Burnside, had ridden with part of his staff in raw winter weather with the thermometer at 0 through Cumberland Gap to Lexington, Kentucky, and there taken the railroad to Louisville, whence he had come down to Nashville, then headquarters of the military division of the Mississippi, which embraced all that region from the Alleghenies to the Rocky Mountains and from the lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. I need scarcely add that he arrived in Nashville weather-stained and travel-worn. He was then about 40 years of age and looked it easily. He had dark sandy hair, light blue eyes, and a bearded face, and a general indifference, but not slouchiness of figure, anything but soldierly as Eastern officers understood things. It is true he wore a major general's uniform, and right well had he earned it, but it was rusty and seedy. His coat was open, and the lapels were buttoned back. His hat bore a gold cord, but was battered and worn. He went about unattended, with his head down and hands much in his pockets. and he looked for all the world more like a country storekeeper or a Western farmer than the illustrious conqueror of Vicksburg and Chattanooga and the commander in chief now of 500,000 of men. He was a West Pointer indeed, and had distinguished himself in Mexico as a lieutenant, but he looked little like our traditional cadet, natty and well set up, or usual regular officer, and to my Eastern eye was a decidedly disappointment. I'd been accustomed to such trim and soldierly figures as McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, all of whom looked the officer and army commander, but here was a man of different caliber, evidently intent on everything but show. On second glance, however, he clearly improved. As you caught his eye, you found it clear and penetrating, and saw it could be hard as flint, as well as soft as dew, and it was easy to perceive that there was a grip and grit in his face and jaw that would enable him to dare great things and hold on mightily and toil terribly when the hour had struck and the time had come. When he came to talk, you found him few of words and slow of speech, but he knew exactly what he wanted and why and when he wanted it. And when you left his presence, you could not help feeling that here was a man of grave and serious purpose, gentle in manner, and bent on great things, cast in the mold of a Cromwell or a Wellington rather than a Napoleon. And you instinctively felt he would be loyal to the end and could be trusted all through. He took a rebel house at Nashville and was soon settled down and hard at work. His staff was small and his headquarters void of show. He attended few parades and reviews. He hated long letters and prolix reports, but he had the telegraph brought into his quarters, and every day, with a telegrapher by his side, would talk all over his great military division and with Washington. And every night he knew precisely where the enemy was and what he was doing and what we were able to do and dare. In other words, he knew the value of time and in an hour or so would accomplish by telegraph what some other commanders would waste days in doing by pen and paper. So, also, he knew how to decide. What a great description by Rusling. We get the description of Grant, the physical look of him. He's that Western farmer, that Western storekeeper that was described oftentimes in the 19th century. Definitely not at all like the finer dressed, trim, taller guys in the East. He's a tough Western guy. And then there's also that second glance. It's not the tough guy exterior. There's also that soft side underneath. I also like the detail that he was slow speaking. I don't hear that or read that quite so often. Then, of course, there's the two strengths. He has that power of time. He understands the urgency. He feels that sense of moving forward, that momentum. And yet, he also understands that he has to decide. It's one thing to understand time and feel the urgency, but then to act in the moment and be unafraid. So that's what Rusling sees in his description. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.